Two friends sit down for dinner. The bill arrives. One of them, a man who, by any measure, has done well for himself, glances at it, splits it evenly, adds a fair tip, and moves on. His friend, less established, insists on covering the whole thing, tips well past what the service earned, and later mentions it twice, just so it does not go unnoticed. Nobody at that table would guess which one has more money. If anything, the instinct runs backward. The generous, expressive spender looks like the success story. The quiet, unremarkable one looks like he is being careful, maybe even a little tight. This scene repeats constantly, in versions large and small, and almost nobody reads it correctly in the moment. We are trained to read spending as a signal of character, generosity as warmth, restraint as coldness. So we keep misjudging the two people at that table, right up until years later, when one owns a home outright and watches a portfolio grow quietly, and the other is still explaining why this month was tighter than usual. But watch enough of these moments, and a pattern starts to surface. The people who have actually built lasting financial security are not identifiable by what they buy. They are identifiable by what they have quietly stopped buying, and more importantly, by why they stopped. This is not a list of wasteful products, extended warranties, cable packages, name-brand medication. That ground has been covered elsewhere. This is something underneath that, harder to notice because it never shows up on a receipt as what it actually is. Most of the purchases that keep people financially stuck were never really about the object at all. They were about a feeling the object was supposed to produce: permission, belonging, relief, proof that the effort has been worth it. The object is only the delivery mechanism. The actual transaction is emotional. Financially secure people do not simply cut these purchases out through sheer discipline, gritting their teeth every time the urge shows up. That approach rarely survives a hard week. What actually happens is quieter. They notice the feeling underneath the impulse, deal with it directly, and the purchase that used to feel necessary simply stops feeling necessary. Nobody sees the moment it happens. The urge is just gone, because the thing it was trying to solve got solved somewhere else. Here are 10 purchases that tend to fall away once that shift happens. The first is the upgrade. Not the essential replacement, the phone that finally dies, the laptop that can no longer run anything, but the reflexive upgrade, the new model bought while the old one still works perfectly, because newness itself has started to feel like the purchase. Azim Premji, who built Wipro into one of India's largest technology companies and became one of the wealthiest men in Asia, was known for driving an ordinary car long after he could have owned almost anything on the road, and for keeping the same modest office for decades while running a company worth billions. Employees meeting him for the first time were reportedly surprised to learn which office was his. None of this came from an inability to afford better. It came from the simple absence of a need that most upgrade purchases are quietly built to satisfy. The need to prove, to himself as much as anyone watching, that he had arrived somewhere. Once that hunger fades, the newest version of anything stops carrying much emotional weight. It becomes just an object, evaluated on whether the current one still works, and most of the time, it still does. The second is the just-in-case purchase. The backup gadget, the extra set of tools, the duplicate kitchen appliance bought not because it will be used, but because the version already owned feels somehow insufficient for an imagined future emergency. The technology entrepreneur Derek Sivers, after selling his company for many millions, deliberately stripped his life down to what fit in a single suitcase, moving between countries with almost nothing beyond a laptop and a change of clothes. His reasoning was not really about money at all, and it certainly was not about deprivation. It was that every extra possession is a small, ongoing obligation, something to store, something to maintain, something to ensure, something to eventually worry about losing or replacing. Owning less, in his experience, did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like removing a long list of quiet background tasks he had never agreed to take on. The fear driving the just-in-case purchase is real, and dismissing it outright rarely works, because the brain generating it is not being irrational, only imprecise about probability. Financially secure people tend to sit with that discomfort directly, asking plainly how likely the imagined emergency actually is, rather than buying their way out of it. Most of the time, when the question gets asked honestly, the emergency was never especially likely to begin with. The third is retail therapy, the purchase made specifically to repair a mood. Researchers studying emotional spending, including the behavioral economist Dan Ariely, have shown repeatedly that people make measurably worse financial decisions when they are trying to regulate a feeling rather than evaluating an actual need. The stress purchase after a difficult meeting, the reward purchase after a long week, the boredom purchase made simply to feel something happen. None of them are really about the item that gets added to the cart. They are an attempt to outsource an emotional problem to a credit card, asking a transaction to do the work that rest, a conversation, or a walk outside was actually needed for. The purchase does provide relief, briefly, often for less than an hour, which is precisely long enough to make the pattern feel effective and worth repeating. The feeling underneath is still there the next morning, unresolved, now joined by a bill, and frequently, an object that never gets used. Financially secure people are not necessarily calmer by temperament. Many have simply learned to name the actual feeling out loud before reaching for a card, which is often enough to break the automatic link between the two. The fourth is what might be called the reciprocity tax, the over-tipping, the over-gifting, the expensive rounds bought for a group specifically to be liked. The psychologist Robert Cialdini spent decades studying how reciprocity functions as one of the most powerful levers in human persuasion, strong enough that a small, unsolicited gift can reliably produce a much larger return favor, and easy enough to weaponize that people regularly use it against themselves without any outside pressure at all, spending simply to manufacture a feeling of being valued by the room. Financially secure people are frequently generous, often more generous than their spending habits suggest at a glance. But the generosity tends to be quiet and decided well before the moment arrives, rather than performed in real time to be seen and remembered. The difference is not the amount changing hands. It is whether the spending is trying to purchase affection on the spot, or simply expressing affection that was already there. If any of these four are landing close to home, that is the point of this video. Not a criticism of anyone watching it. None of these habits make a person foolish, and none are unique to people who struggle with money. They show up in high earners just as often, sometimes more, because a bigger income simply buys a more expensive version of the same unresolved feeling. What separates the outcomes over 20 or 30 years is not intelligence or income. It is whether someone eventually notices the pattern early enough for it to matter. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, subscribing helps this channel keep making it. Now, stick around, because the next 6 get even more specific. The fifth is the brand tax paid on ordinary staples, the cleaning products, the pantry basics, the household goods bought at a premium purely because a familiar label feels safer, even when blind comparisons repeatedly show people cannot tell the difference. This is a different habit from the well-known name brand medication example, because it applies not to one obvious purchase, but to dozens of small, forgettable ones scattered across every trip to the store. The dish soap, the paper towels, the cooking oil, the laundry detergent. Individually, the premium on any one of these is a few coins, barely worth mentioning, which is exactly why it survives scrutiny a bigger purchase would not. Across a household over a decade, that scattered premium adds up to a meaningful, uncounted leak nobody notices, because no single instance of it ever feels large enough to question. The sixth is the unused membership, the gym card, the streaming service, the professional subscription kept active for months or years after the actual use stopped, purely because canceling would feel like admitting the money already spent was wasted. This is the sunk cost fallacy.
first formally described in Decision Research by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and it may be one of the most expensive blind spots in ordinary financial life, precisely because it disguises itself as loyalty rather than what it actually is. The money already spent is gone either way, whether the membership gets canceled today or renewed for another year out of guilt. Continuing to pay does not recover a single cent of it. It only adds a second, ongoing loss stacked on top of the first. And unlike the first, this one is entirely optional. The seventh is the hustle symbol, the elaborate planner, the productivity course, the color-coded system bought in the hope that owning the tool will produce the discipline the tool is meant to support. There is a strange comfort in acquiring the equipment of self-improvement instead of doing the less photogenic work it was bought to support. A new planner feels like progress the moment it arrives. The feeling is genuine. It is also almost entirely disconnected from whether anything actually changes afterward. Financially secure people tend to notice fairly quickly when a purchase is functioning as a substitute for action rather than a support for it, and stop paying for the substitute the moment that becomes clear. The eighth is the scarcity purchase, the flash sale, the doorbuster, the countdown timer that turns an ordinary decision into an urgent one.
Scarcity is one of the oldest tools in persuasion, precisely because it borrows the brain's response to genuine emergencies and applies it to a discount code counting down in the corner of a screen. Almost nothing sold this way is actually gone tomorrow. The identical item is typically back on sale within weeks, sometimes for even less. The urgency is manufactured on purpose, and once someone has been burned by a few doorbuster purchases they did not really want, once the excitement wore off, the countdown timer stops producing any response in them at all. The ninth is the comparison purchase. The purchase triggered less by need than by watching someone nearby acquire something first. The renovation, the vehicle, the vacation, the gadget. The social psychologist Leon Festinger described this tendency to measure our own position primarily through the people immediately around us, rather than any fixed standard, which explains why the same income can feel generous in one neighborhood and inadequate in another, without a single number changing. It is an efficient way to spend money on someone else's life instead of your own. Financially secure people are not immune to noticing what others have. The noticing still happens, quietly, the same as it does for anyone. They have simply learned to treat that flicker of comparison as information about their own state of mind, worth being curious about, rather than as an instruction to go and match it. The 10th, and in some ways the quietest, is the someday shelf. The books on transformation never finished. The courses on becoming a different kind of person never completed, purchased in the hope that owning the material for change would substitute for actually changing. There is nothing wrong with books or courses on their own, and plenty are genuinely useful to people who actually finish them. The habit worth noticing is buying the identity of a changed person before doing the work required to earn it. Then, when the purchase unsurprisingly fails to deliver a transformation it was never capable of delivering alone, quietly buying another one instead of opening the first. There is a version of this story that ends the way most of these videos end, with a household budget quietly tightened and a bit more money left in the account each month. That version is true, and it matters over the long run. But the more interesting version belongs to a man named Chuck Feeney, who built a business empire worth billions through duty-free shops in airports around the world, and who spent decades giving nearly all of it away in complete secret, so effectively hidden that Forbes magazine kept listing his net worth in the hundreds of millions, long after it had actually fallen to almost nothing. He flew coach on every flight. He carried his papers in a plastic shopping bag instead of a briefcase. He wore an ordinary watch, and for years he did not own or rent a permanent home of his own, moving between borrowed apartments instead. When the secret finally came out publicly, what struck people was not the size of the giving, staggering as it was. It was how little he had ever appeared to need any of it to feel like his life was already complete.
That is the real thread connecting everyone in this video. From the man calmly splitting a dinner bill at the beginning to Feeney quietly giving away a fortune nobody around him knew he still had. The purchase was never really the point in any of these 10 habits.
It was always a stand-in for something it could never actually deliver. Safety, belonging, proof that the effort had been worth it, relief from a feeling no transaction was ever built to resolve. Once that underlying need gets addressed directly, instead of being purchased around indefinitely, the buying tends to quietly stop on its own. Nobody has to force it. There is simply nothing left for it to compensate for.